Shelley.
Hi,
How are you?
I'm good. Just came back from choir rehearsal, so we're going to eat and listen at the same time.
Okay, no problem.
We're gonna drink and listen.
Hey, Barry.
Okay.
So are we.
I wish I could join you.
We wish you could too.
Well, we've got a nice crowd on now.
Yeah. And then whatever's on YouTube.
Yeah, right.
Sure. Wait a couple minutes.
Right, if everybody, just make sure you're muted and your cameras are off. And then at the end, when the rabbi's done, we'll open it up for questions and comments. Steve, please mute yourself.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. It's great to have you here at our adult education. I think this is our second adult education of the year. And our discussion this evening is going to center around Israel and mostly around the new coalition that is governing Israel and its relationship to the United States and the United States government. Now, before I begin, a couple of things I think you need to keep in the back of your mind when we're talking about this new coalition that exists in Israel, and that is that the Israel that exists today, 73 years young, is not your grandparents' Israel, nor is it your parents' Israel. And I say that because we sort of have, many people have this romantic notion of what Israel is, or what Israel is supposed to be, or what Israel is supposed to represent. And whereas some of those things may have been viable in years past, this new generation that lives in Israel may not necessarily conform to the old ideas of what Israel was, is supposed to be, or is going to be. So if you could keep that in the back of your mind during this presentation, and we can certainly talk about that at the end, and go on from there, because some of what you're going to hear tonight is actually quite new. It is going to be in disagreement with what you think about Israel. It's going to come into conflict with some of the traditional ideas about Israel. And I'm not making a value judgment that these things are necessarily good or bad, positive or negative. It is the way things are, and it's the way things that have unfolded in the state of Israel, in Medinat Yisrael. Couple of things that, for a couple of first things that you should know about this new government. The coalition that's now headed by Naftali Bennett includes a vast spectrum of lawmakers: Orthodox, Arab, female, gay, Reform, even Israel's first deaf Knesset member. For the first time in 12 years, Israel's Likud party and its head, Benjamin Netanyahu, is no longer going to be governing in Israel. It's moving, or it has moved, from the prime minister's seat to the opposition in the Knesset, which is Israel's parliament. This new government brings into power a broad coalition of 8 dynamic political parties, and they span from the very far left to the very far right. In other words, from the very most ultra-liberal to the most ultra-conservative. This 36th government is headed by the Yamina party leader, Naftali Bennett. He is the 13th prime minister of the state of Israel. He was sworn in along with the Yesh Atid party leader, Yair Lapid, who is actually going to serve as alternate prime minister and foreign minister until becoming Israel's 14th prime minister in August of 2023. And he will serve as prime minister for the final 2 years of the term, if all goes according to plan. And I say that because the government is a very fragile government because of the vast differences and the vast spectrum that this government represents. There's a number of notable firsts in this 36th Knesset that was formed with the primary intention of unseating Benjamin Netanyahu and bringing change to Israel. But you need to understand that this coalition came about predominantly because there was a huge desire to unseat Benjamin Netanyahu, not necessarily because they agreed on politics or they agreed on issues or they agreed on the social society structure. That's not why this government came about. It came about primarily for the unseating of Benjamin Netanyahu. So here's a number of firsts that you might be interested in. Naftali Bennett, who is 49 years old, is the first prime minister from the high-tech world. He headed and sold 2 successful software companies, Sayodo and Soluto. He is the first prime minister to wear a kippah all the time, and the ruling coalition includes an Arab party. which is the Islamist Ra'am party, while other parties representing Israel's 21% Arab minority, they chose to remain in the opposition. The incoming health minister, Nitzim Horowitz, is the first openly gay Knesset member to head a major party. He heads the Meretz party. The 36th Knesset includes two longtime disability activists, Shirley Pinto, Israel's first deaf Knesset member, and Karen Elahar, a veteran member of Knesset who has muscular dystrophy. This is the Minister of Energy. There are 9 female cabinet ministers out of a total of 27, so a third of the cabinet ministers are women, the highest number in Israel's history. There are 2 Arab cabinet ministers, Asawi Frege and Hamad Amar. 2 new members hail from English-speaking countries. One is from Cape Town, South Africa, and one is from North Carolina. The Knesset has only had 8 American-born members in its 73-year history. Bennett, like Benjamin Netanyahu, is a fluent English speaker. He was born in Haifa, but he was born to American immigrants who spoke to him only in English. There are 3 former broadcast journalists in the top echelon, and the incoming Minister of Public Security, Omer Bar-Lev, is heading the same ministry that his father held from 1984 to 1990. And for the very first time in the history of Israel, they have the first Reform rabbi who is a member of the Knesset, the first publicly elected Reform rabbi to be part of the Knesset. So those are some of the firsts of this particular coalition. Now, after 12 straight years as Israel's prime minister, Benjamin Netanyahu lost power, and the government that replaced him is pretty remarkable in its own right. Netanyahu's ouster is a huge deal on its own. Over the past decade plus, Netanyahu was Israel's longest serving leader. He became synonymous with Israel. He shaped its foreign and domestic policy as well as its international image, and personally guided its relationship with the United States. Over the past few years, his desire to hold on to power, even as he stands trial on corruption charges, along with his opponent's desire to oust him, had driven Israel's political system into a crisis. He became so personally polarizing that a range of ideological allies turned against him and finally replaced him. Now, Netanyahu's opponents succeeded in defeating him, and when they got sworn in, the government that they formed has broken all kinds of boundaries. It's an unprecedented alliance of the political right and left, Jews and Arabs, all dedicated to one goal. That goal is what you need to keep in mind. The goal of this government was not Israel. The goal of this government was to end the Netanyahu era. And I can't impress upon you how important that is. The goal of this government coming together was to end Netanyahu's era. And at the same time, there are ways that even under this new leadership, Israel is actually unlikely to change. Here's what you need to know about this new government. Israel had been trying and failing to elect a stable government for over 2 years. Netanyahu came close to losing power before this, but now it actually happened. A little bit of background. Benjamin Netanyahu seemed to have won Israel's 2019 election, but his former partners deserted him and he couldn't form a coalition. So Israel held another election, and then it held another election, and then it held another election, and then it held another election. Each time, neither Benjamin Netanyahu nor his opponents had gained any kind of a majority in the Knesset. There was a brief interlude where the rivals came together to form a coalition to address the pandemic, but that fell apart really pretty quickly. This time around, Netanyahu's opponents weren't able to team up. And if that didn't happen, Israel would have had to have held a sixth election. No one wanted that to happen. So Netanyahu's rivals decided to put aside their vast differences and to form a coalition with that one goal that I reiterated earlier, to get rid of him. This new coalition is a testament to how much Israeli politics had become about Benjamin Netanyahu himself. 3 of the parties in this new government largely agree with Netanyahu on policy, but they dislike him so much that they'd rather team up with the Israeli left than to give him another term in office. This amounts, I think, to what you might call a political reset for Israel. To have any real memory of Israel before Benjamin Netanyahu's tenure, you'd have to have been born well before the iPhone was released. For over a decade, Netanyahu's personality and politics have dominated Israel. But of course, no longer. Now, understand that there have been left-right coalitions in Israel before. But to reach a majority of Israel's 120-seat parliament, the Knesset, the anti-Netanyahu alliance, is doing something that's truly unprecedented in Israeli history. It is inviting an independent Arab Israeli party to join the governing coalition. That, in and of itself, is huge. That hasn't happened before for a few reasons. Although Arabs make up 20% of Israel's citizenry, Israel's largest political parties, both on the left and the right, didn't see Arab parties as legitimate political powers in a Jewish state. Arab parties, likewise, did not want to be seen as granting legitimacy to Jewish governments. And often the policy differences between Jewish and Arab parties were vast. But 7 decades after Israel was founded, things have changed. Arab leaders have become more vocal about demanding a say in the way that their country is governed. And the ongoing stalemate gave the Arab parties a chance to be kingmaker. Faced with the prospect of losing power last year, Netanyahu consistently attacked the very idea of Arab citizens voting in elections. He said he'd be willing to partner with Ra'am, the Islamist Israeli party. That legitimized the idea of including Arabs in Israeli coalitions. And now Ra'am has joined Netanyahu's rivals and gives them the absolute slimmest of majorities. Arabs have almost always been represented in Israel's parliament, but now for the first time ever, an Arab party will have an active say in Israel's government. Now, it is a narrow and unwieldy coalition of left and right. The coalition was always unified, remember, on the goal of ousting Netanyahu. But it's divided on pretty much everything else. It contains 8 different political parties, an unusually large number, even in Israel's famously tumultuous politics. And it will have the smallest possible majority in the Knesset. So, to get anything done, every single member is going to have to agree. To reconcile the different factions, the coalition is going to have, as I mentioned earlier, 2 prime ministers. Naftali Bennett, who I told you heads the right-wing Yamina party, he will serve 2 years. And then Yair Lapid, the leader of the centrist Yesh Atid party, will take over for just about the same amount of time. Both of them had historically small parties. Yesh Atid, the centrist party, only has 17 seats, as opposed to the 30 that were held by Netanyahu's Likud party. Yamina will have a paltry 6 seats. But this unorthodox arrangement is the only way to keep everyone in the coalition happy. It's unclear, even to this day, how long this coalition will last. Previous ones that were more ideological coherent have all fallen apart. But no matter how long Naftali Bennett serves, he will earn the distinction of being the politician who replaced Benjamin Netanyahu. He is a staunch right-winger, often further to the right than Netanyahu. He opposes Palestinian statehood. He supports West Bank settlement expansion and has vowed to pursue a very hawkish defense policy. He'll also be, as I mentioned earlier, the very first religious Israeli prime minister. Netanyahu has become a reliable ally of the Haredi, or the ultra-Orthodox. But personally, he lives a secular life, just like all of his predecessors had. Bennett identifies as Orthodox, not Haredi, but Orthodox, and he wears the kippah. His ascent to power in Israel is a sign of the growth, and I believe the growing influence of religious Zionists in a state that was founded by secular Jewish socialists. Now, let me repeat that. His ascent to become prime minister is a sign of the growing influence of religious Zionists, and we can talk about what religious Zionism is later, in a state that was founded by secular Jewish socialists. He'll also be the first Israeli prime minister born of American parents. Like Netanyahu, he speaks fluent English. Basically, he speaks natural English. When he worked in the tech world, before he entered politics, he spent the vast majority of his time living in New York City. He lived in Manhattan for over 20 years. Before fighting broke out between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, the same coalition appeared to be coming together. But the conflict in Gaza and the interethnic clashes in Israel threatened to derail it. Party leaders did not negotiate as the rockets were flying. Mansour Abbas, the leader of the Ra'am, the Arab party, froze talks with Yair Lapid. And Bennett said he would no longer partner with the alliance of Netanyahu opponents. Then, soon after the sides reached a ceasefire, everyone seemed to return to where they had been before the fighting started. Bennett wrote a long Facebook post bashing Netanyahu. Abbas renewed negotiations. Lapid began signing coalition agreements with other parties. It may be that the fighting, after almost stopping this coalition in its tracks, ended up giving this new coalition an even greater urgency than it had prior to that. There are a lot of ways that Israel's government are going to be different. But there are also plenty of ways that it's going to be the same. First, like every prime minister that's not named Golda Meir, the current leader of Israel is an Ashkenazi Jewish man. And in certain ways, the government will be actually less diverse than previous ones. Although it's going to include an unprecedented number of parties, all but one of the parties is led by a man. None of the parties are led by Mizrahi Jews. In other words, none of the parties are led by Jews of Middle Eastern or Near Eastern descent. And none of the parties are Haredi. After 6 years in which Haredi parties were given control of Israel's religious affairs, on the one hand, that means the government could reform Israel's religious policies, perhaps reducing funding to Haredi institutions, requiring Haredi men to enter Israel's mandatory military draft, or liberalizing Israel's Jewish conversion and marriage system, which are controlled by the Haredi chief rabbinate. But on the other hand, the coalition is so narrow and so fragmented that it may be hard to pass any kind of major legislation that will produce these kinds of changes in Israel. And on that note, it seems to me, again, this is simply my opinion, it seems to me that we should not expect this to be a government that's going to make peace with the Palestinians. Bennett opposes Palestinian statehood, as do other members of the coalition. Likewise, the left-wing and Arab parties will likely block any attempt to annex parts of the West Bank. Now, other governments have come in with policy platforms or an ideological program, but this one, remember, and I keep reiterating it, this one came together to oust Netanyahu and to end the political crisis. It has accomplished its goal for the moment. Bennett got sworn in. What happens next is going to be anybody's guess whatsoever. Now, I told you I wanted to include in my talk tonight, which I will do right now, is kind of an assessment on the fact that there are new leaders and a new era in play. And I want to talk a little bit about United States-Israel relations as we kind of reach this crossroad. I think both Israel and the United States are at crossroads. There are new leaders in both countries who have inherited a relationship that is at once imperiled by increasingly partisan domestic political considerations, but they're also deeply bound in history and an ingrained recognition that both the United States and Israel need one another. How President Joe Biden and Prime Minister Naftali Bennett manage that relationship, I think, will shape the prospects for peace and stability in the Middle East. They're ushering in an era no longer defined by the powerful personality of the long-serving Benjamin Netanyahu, who repeatedly defied the Obama administration and then reaped the rewards of a warm relationship with then President Donald Trump. Bennett's government says it wants to repair relations with the Democrats and restore bipartisan support in the United States for Israel. Biden, meanwhile, is trying to pursue what I think is a more balanced approach on the Palestinian conflict and primarily on Iran. The relationship is crucial to both countries. Israel has long regarded the United States, of course, as its closest ally, and even more importantly, as the guarantor of its security and international standing, while the U.S. counts on Israel's military and intelligence prowess in a very turbulent Middle East. Both Biden and Bennett are also restrained, I think, by domestic politics. Bennett leads this uncertain coalition of 8 parties from across Israel's political spectrum, whose main point of convergence was, of course, removing Netanyahu. Biden, on the other hand, is struggling to bridge a divide, first of all, in his own party, the Democrats, where near uniform support for Israel has eroded, and a progressive wing wants the U.S. to do more to end Israel's half-century occupation of lands the Palestinians want for a future state. Shortly after taking office, the new Israeli Foreign Minister, Yair Lapid, recognized the challenges Israel faces in Washington. He said the following: "We find ourselves with a Democratic White House, Senate, and House, and they are angry." Lapid said this upon taking the helm at Israel's foreign ministry. "We need to change the way that we work with them." I think, or at least it seems to me in my taking of what goes on and what's going on in the Middle East, the key test on all of this is going to be on Iran. Joe Biden has sought to return to the Iran nuclear deal that President Obama saw as a signature foreign policy achievement. Donald Trump withdrew from the pact, to the cheers of pro-Israel U.S. lawmakers and Israel. And though Iran has not really yet accepted Biden's offer for direct negotiations, indirect discussions on the nuclear deal are now in probably the 7th or 8th round in Vienna. The new Israeli government remains staunchly opposed to Biden's effort to resurrect the deal. But it maintains it will discuss the issue behind closed doors, rather than staging public confrontations, such as Netanyahu's controversial address slamming the agreement to the United States Congress in 2015. In a conversation with Secretary of State Antony Blinken, Lapid said the two agreed on a no surprises policy and to keep lines of communication open. Eitan Gilboa, an expert on U.S.-Israel relations at Israel's Bar-Ilan University, says that rather than trying to scuttle any agreement with Iran, the new government is going to press the United States administration to keep some sanctions on Iran in place and to seek strategic compensation for Israel as part of any return to the deal. Resolving differences over the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I think, will be another significant challenge for these two leaders, Bennett and Biden. Biden has already moved to reverse Netanyahu-backed Trump policies that alienated the Palestinians and caused a near total rupture in official U.S.-Palestinian contacts. Almost immediately after taking office, Biden restored Trump-slashed U.S. assistance to the Palestinians, which in just a number of months totals over $300 million. He announced his administration's intent to reopen the United States consulate in Jerusalem that was closed by Donald Trump, that handled relationships with the Palestinians. And administration officials have spoken of the imperative that Israelis and Palestinians enjoy equal measures of security and prosperity. Yet neither Biden nor Blinken have signaled to date any move to alter Trump's most significant pro-Israel steps. And those include his abandonment of long-standing U.S. policy that settlements are illegitimate under international law, his recognition of Jerusalem as capital of Israel, and his recognition of Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights, territory that was seized from Syria in the 1967 Arab-Israeli War. The administration also hopes to expand Arab-Israeli normalization agreements that the Trump administration forged in its final months in office. In a call on Naftali Bennett's first day in office, Biden affirmed his steadfast support for the U.S.-Israel relationship and unwavering commitment to Israel's security. He pledged to work together on all security matters, including Iran. That's a quote. Biden's support for Israel's heavy airstrikes during the war with Gaza's militant Hamas rulers, who fired thousands of rockets of Israel, angered progressive Democrats in Congress. With newfound strength in numbers, they demanded that the administration do more to support the Palestinians and the conditions be placed on the massive amount of military aid the United States provides Israel. While well-established Democratic lawmakers remain unstintingly supportive of Israel and its absolute right to defend itself, The growing number of progressive voices in their caucus have turned the issue, I think, into a political hot potato. The change in Israel's government is unlikely to ease their calls for action as Israeli-Palestinian violence has continued over recent days. And yet the Biden administration has already urged the new Israeli government to ease tensions with the Palestinians. In 2 phone conversations with Lapid, Blinken has spoken of the need to improve Israeli-Palestinian relations in practical ways and pledged to deepen Arab-Israeli ties. It's not clear, at least to today, that this new coalition government will in any way be responsive to that call by Anthony Blinken. Centrist members like Lapid and Defense Minister Benny Gantz clearly want to adopt a more cooperative approach with the Biden administration, while Bennett and his right-wing partners face pressure from their base to maintain Netanyahu's hardline approach, not only on Iran, but also on the conflict with the Palestinians. The former prime minister, already eyeing a return to office, has branded Bennett as a weak and inexperienced individual and will probably pounce on any perceived capitulations. The Israeli government already faces tough decisions, including whether to evacuate an unauthorized settlement outpost established and whether to intervene in the legal process through which settler organizations are trying to evict dozens of Palestinian families from their homes in East Jerusalem. The Biden administration is pressing Israel to refrain from any unilateral steps, such as settlement expansions or evictions, that could hinder the eventual revival of the peace process, which has been dead for more than a decade. But Washington has yet to issue public condemnations of settlement activity beyond the general calls for both sides to refrain from unilateral steps that could inflame tensions or harm prospects for an eventual peace deal. Bennett is a strong supporter of settlements. He is virtually opposed to Palestinian statehood, but he is also seen by many as a pragmatist. He may be able to turn his weakness into a strength, arguing that any major concession to the Palestinians or the settlers risks bringing down the government and returning Netanyahu to power. The forces that brought this coalition to power are strong enough, I think, to sustain the pressure from the right and probably also American pressure to make a major change in the policies toward the Palestinians. Now, the members of Israel's government coalition breathed a collective sigh of relief this fall in a move that was seen as a key victory for the Bennett-Lapid government. Lawmakers passed a state budget well ahead of the then looming November 14th deadline. The 2021 budget, you need to understand how important this was. The 2021 budget was the first to be approved in over 3 years, following a prolonged political stalemate that had seen the country capitulated into a seemingly never-ending cycle of elections. Had this budget failed to pass, Israel would have had to go to a sixth round of elections in the space of just 2 years. Prime Minister Bennett, Foreign Minister Lapid, and Finance Minister Lieberman hailed the move, calling it the end of 3 years of instability. And yet, even with this first major obstacle behind Israel's coalition government, which is made up of diverse parties from across the wide political perspective and ideological spectrum of Israel, there are several important tests, I think, that you need to keep in mind that could upset this stability. One is that the Biden administration's pending decision on whether to open a consulate in East Jerusalem for Palestinians could prove to be a pivotal moment for this coalition. The question is how far the Biden administration is willing to push. They are discussing the consulate in East Jerusalem, which could snowball into a political crisis. It's also been discussed to place, Bennett and Lapid want this consulate opened in Ramallah. The left-wing parties in the coalition, Meretz and Labor, will also be forced to decide whether they support or they oppose this motion. There is pressure on Bennett, particularly from his own party, as well as from other parties in the coalition, as well as pressure from the Biden administration. Both Bennett and Lapid have thus far to date presented a pretty united front in their opposition to reopening the consulate and suggested instead, as I mentioned, that this consulate be placed in the Palestinian city of Ramallah, which is the current seat of the Palestinian Authority. Palestinians claim East Jerusalem as the capital of a future state, while Israelis hold that Jerusalem is its absolute indivisible capital. There is no question, there is no negotiating that Jerusalem will only be the capital of Israel. Joe Biden has vowed to reopen a consulate in Jerusalem, which was closed by Donald Trump in 2018. And another hurdle that's facing the coalition is construction in the West Bank settlements. The construction and the housing ministry has announced 1,300 new housing units would be built in several settlements in the West Bank, also referred to in the traditional sense of lands known biblically as Judea and Samaria. And while Washington and a number of parties in the Bennett-Lapid government are opposed to new building in Jewish settlements, right-wing parties in this coalition, including Bennett's own Yamina party, have long evinced a pro-settler policy. There is pressure on Bennett from within his own party and other parties in the coalition, as well as from the Biden administration, to get these settlements built. The government needs to do what it can to avoid taking risks. This coalition cannot really agree, it seems to me, on any common policy, and therefore it seems to me that there will be no new initiatives whatsoever. That means that the only way for Israel to move forward, for instance, on the peace process, is for someone else, namely the Biden administration, to come up with its own initiative so that the government will then have to react to it. as long as the glue that holds everyone together stays in place, that distrust of Benjamin Netanyahu, as long as that glue is relevant, and as long as Netanyahu is still in the system, there is a chance that this coalition can still survive. It's this distrust of Netanyahu that is particularly important. And it's important to remember that as long as that stays in place, and as long as that remains at the forefront of people's concerns, this coalition will remain intact. But now that the initial obstacle in the form of a state budget has been won, which was a huge thing to happen in Israel. I mean, you have no idea how important and how viable that made this government. Now that that initial obstacle to form that budget, that budget and has been won, I think that the ideological differences between the coalition members are more likely to take a forward position and come out into the open. This is not a simple government. They are very liable to get into conflicts. In fact, I can virtually guarantee you that this fledgling government will get into all kinds of conflicts. And I believe that someone will try to light the fuse to ensure that these conflicts do arise, particularly Benjamin Netanyahu and his cohorts. But I believe that as long as Lapid and Bennett keep their eye on those things that are predominantly Israel-centered, I think that this coalition, this fragile coalition, has at the very least, has a 50% chance of surviving. I hope that enlightened you as to what's going on in Israel with the new government. I hope you got a sense of what the relationship between this new government and the fairly new Biden administration government is, and the trepidation that we feel as to the issues that are ahead of Israel. But again, remember what I said at the beginning. This is not your grandparents' or your parents' Israel. This is a new generation of Israelis. This is not this generation that's raised up in Israel is not a generation that's escaping the Holocaust, even though many of their grandparents did escape the Holocaust and came to Israel. That is not the priority of this new generation that's growing up in Israel today. Thank you. You can unmute yourselves and you can ask questions or make comments if you'd like.
Rabbi, what was what was there about Netanyahu? What aspect of him drew all these people together against him?
Drew against who?
Netanyahu. But what was there about him that united all of these people? Was it the corruption?
You mean the coalition? You mean the coalition that Netanyahu was part of?
Yeah.
What united them was mostly the religious organizations and his ability to allow the religious organizations to do whatever they wanted in Israel, and that carried a lot of weight with a lot of people in Israel. And those were the groups that elected him. He was elected predominantly by the Haredi population of Israel. They vote in block. You know, where you have in the United States you have Democrats and you have Republicans and you have independents. You generally, for the most part, in Israel, have people that are allied with a party. You don't have very many independents in Israel who kind of think for themselves and think about what's best for the country. And it's usually whatever the party says or the party line. And when you vote en bloc, when you vote in mass, and you have huge Orthodox populations all voting the same way, that was generally enough to put Benjamin Netanyahu over the top. The other thing that you have to remember is that in Israel, in a parliamentary system, you don't vote for the person, you vote for the party, and it's the party that elects the person to be the prime minister. Okay, you're not necessarily. I mean, it was a given that Netanyahu was head of the Likud party, but when the votes when you voted for the party. You did not vote for Netanyahu. It's a different voting system than here in the United States, where you vote for a person, an individual.
So it was an anti-Likud vote.
It was an anti-Likud, anti-religious, anti-Netanyahu coalition that came together. They were tired of Netanyahu browbeating and ignoring the rest of the country and allowing the Orthodox population of Israel to run ramshod over anything it wanted in Israel and to set the standards of religiosity in Israel. They got tired of that. Plus, they got tired of not having a budget for the last 3 years.
Thank you.
Sure.
So why didn't they have a budget?
They didn't have a budget because they could never come to an agreement. They
Like
never
Israel.
agreed, and anytime they couldn't come to an agreement on a budget, he would dissolve the government and call new elections.
Netanyahu would.
Netanyahu would, yeah. In the parliamentary system, a prime minister can come to the president of the country. In Israel, the prime minister can come to the president of the country and call elections at any time he feels or she feels that they've lost control of the majority, and when they couldn't pass a budget, they lost control of the majority.
Rabbi, there are some people who believe that the Biden administration would rather have Israel and the Middle East on the back burner for the next 4 years.
Yep.
And that basically he's trying to get this very ambitious domestic program through, and nobody's going to remember what he did with Israel as long as nothing explodes in the Middle East. Given that, I mean, where is there seems to be a feeling that the best thing on both sides would be a sort of stasis. But the one thing that I think is unsettling, if you read an article in the New York Times a couple of days ago about what young American Jews, and their relationship to Israel, it was.
Yep.
They aren't our grandparents' Holocaust survivors either.
Right. So the fact is that basically they're the ones who are the future of the Democratic Party.
And of American Judaism.
Right.
Yep.
So
it's
it seems to me that either Biden has to do Biden's best thing is to do nothing. Let's put it that way. And
I think I believe in the next 4 years, aside from possibly opening a consulate, I don't think you're going to see the Biden administration really doing anything in Israel. I think it's going to be pretty much hands off.
And I don't think that's a bad thing.
Oh, I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing either, but I just don't think you don't, you used to have rock solid support in Congress for Israel, and whereas predominantly you have pretty good support for Israel, it's not the kind of rock solid support it was 10, 15, 20 years ago.
You haven't mentioned the Israeli support for the U.S. because of the evangelical force in the United States. How do you think that's playing an influence in U.S. politics in regard to Israel?
I don't know. That's a really good question. I don't know how much. I mean, I saw an interesting statistic which I have not followed out. I haven't followed up. But prior to the pandemic, I mean, you can't really go from the pandemic to today, but prior to the pandemic, tourism to Israel was running 2-to-1 evangelical to Jew. It was just a fascinating statistic where the tourism dollars to Israel were coming from evangelical Christians more so than from Jews in the United States. I mean, I think that says a lot. I don't know how much the United States government is pandering to the evangelical Christian group in the United States. I haven't really seen much about that. So I don't know, but I do know that it is a predominant force in Israel in terms of tourism, and has been in terms of tourism. In fact, I read a really interesting statistic, and that something like the first 10 or 12 planes to come into Israel after the restrictions were lifted from the pandemic, from COVID, were all evangelical Christian tour groups. I mean, it was just a fascinating thing to read, that it wasn't Jews who were coming to Israel after the pandemic. It was evangelical Christians.
Fran Olick has a question.
Sure.
I've forgotten his first name. His name is Abba. And
Excuse
he's
me?
a very, Abba is a representative, very firm representative of the Palestinian, and he has gotten the reputation of being a remarkable negotiator and getting things done for the Arab population. What's his role in the government?
His role is Commissioner for Arab Affairs, and the other Arab minister, I think, is Minister of Energy, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, those are the two posts that the two Arabs from the Arab Party hold in the government. And I think it's great. I think it's fabulous that there is finally an Arab party represented in the Knesset, especially since 20% of Israel's population is Arab. I think it's great. What I would love to know, and that what I'm going to say is true. But you don't know what exactly it is, and what's true is this group of this Arab party was promised something to be part of this government. I don't know exactly what they were promised. I don't know when it will come about. I think it will probably not come about for a year or two, because until things, die, the newness dies down. But I don't see this party joining this coalition for any reason other than there were certain promises that were made to them in terms of the Palestinian, Arab, Bedouin population that would ultimately take place. In Israel.
I think now they have.
Excuse
I think
me?
now they have a voice in the government, which they didn't have before, and a rather vocal person.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's great that they have a voice in the. I mean, I think after 73 years, I think it's time that they have that they have. It's the same thing that I think it's time that there's a reform rabbi who's a member of Knesset. You know, after all these years. But I've not heard of any discussions, deliberations. I've not heard of any lectures or talks by him. So I have not seen anything in the press about anything that's gone on behind the scenes or publicly as to the relationship between Naftali Bennett and the Ram party. So
Irene has a question.
The answer is I don't know, but I do firmly believe that something was there. It just does not seem logical to me that they would join for no reason. It just doesn't seem logical for the historic value. I think something was promised that will take place in the next couple of years while Bennett is the prime minister.
Irene, you got a question? Got to unmute yourself, Irene.
Irene?
I am unmuting. There, okay. First, I have to make a comment. Thank goodness for Jesus, or we wouldn't have the support for Israel in the United States, among these evangelicals. But my question is about the president's role in Israel. Everything seems to revolve around what the Knesset does, what the prime minister does. What role does the president of Israel play in terms of the Knesset, and does he have any influence over the Knesset?
Okay, he has no role in the Knesset whatsoever. He's not a member of the Knesset. He can be invited to speak to the Knesset, but he has to receive an invitation to speak to the Knesset. He has no political power whatsoever. The president of Israel is primarily a ceremonial position.
Is it elected?
Is it elected?
Yes. Is it an elected position?
Not an elected position. It's an elected position. Yes. It is an elected position, but it's not a politically elected position. It's primarily a ceremonial position. The president presides at ceremonies. The president will welcome international visitors to Israel. The president will come to the United States in a ceremonial role, but he or she. I mean, there's never been a female president, but he has nothing to do with the Knesset. Has no vote, has no veto power, has no tie-breaking power. Nothing. There's no power whatsoever with the Knesset.
Rabbi,
but it is elected.
could we go back to the evangelicals for a second? Because it's hard for me to resolve in my own mind. Aren't they the same people that think this is a Christian nation and want this to have one religion?
Yep.
Is it Jews are okay as long as they're in Israel?
No, it's that Israel is where the Messiah will come through. Okay, so Israel has to continue to exist as a state or as a country in order to allow for the Messiah to make his appearance into the world again. There's a gate if you go to the old city, there are 7 gates, and one of them is called the Golden Gate, which is all blocked up and bricked in, and it's through this gate that the Messiah will appear. So it's in the hopes of the Messiah appearing. That's why, that's because without Israel, there's no Messiah. Without Israel, without the Messiah coming in through Jerusalem, there is no Messiah. And evangelical Christians firmly believe in the coming of a Messiah. Okay?
Yeah, well, okay.
They are
Explains a lot.
Israel. They are more pro-Israel than many, unfortunately, more than many Jewish communities. I will tell you.
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
Yeah, I think that that group of evangelicals are actually more pro-Israel than too many Jewish communities are. And your point is made, which is correct, that really their need for Israel to be able to fulfill their prophecy is Israel. But the real question is, if you ask Joe Biden what his priority is it more support for Israel or to pass an Iran deal, which is not in the best interest of Israel? That's the question I'd like to be asked.
I think Joe Biden is so on Israel. I think
Right.
it's important to him to pass an Iran deal, whatever form that Iran deal takes. I think Israel for Joe Biden is a hot potato, and he's going to keep shifting it from hand to hand to hand to hand, because it's very unstable. I mean, the government is unstable. The populations there are. It's very. There's no solid win for Joe Biden in the Middle East. I mean, I can't even begin to imagine there will be any kind of a agreement on a peace plan in Joe Biden's tenure as president of the United States. No matter how long he's president, whether he's president for 4 years or 8 years, I don't think you'll see, especially if this government continues to make traction. Going back to the evangelicals for a minute, just for a moment, there's a pretty famous quote of Benjamin Netanyahu, which actually lost him a lot of points with Israelis, but he and with American Jews, when he famously said that he doesn't need American Jews coming to Israel. He has plenty of evangelical Christians supporting the tourism industry. He doesn't need the American Jews coming to Israel. So, I mean, that was his take on evangelical Christians. He saw them as a cash cow, or he sees them as a cash cow for Israel, which they very may well be.
Or more genuine support than a litany of American Jews.
Well, again, you have American Jews who don't. There are American Jews who remember the reason Israel was formed, and you have American Jews who have no clue as to why Israel was formed.
Or there are American Jews who believe that Israel has responsibility as a Jewish state to perhaps be morally and governmentally a step better than it's been in the recent past.
And that's one of the questions.
That's true too.
That's one of the questions that Israel is in and of itself asking itself. Is Israel a Jewish state? Is that the purpose of Israel, to be a Jewish state? Or is Israel simply to be a democratic state in the Middle East and not necessarily be a Jewish homeland? That is a source of huge tension in Israel. Huge tension. And again, you have parties, 8 parties that run the gamut as to, with Bennett saying that of course Israel has to be a Jewish homeland. Of course, Israel has to be a Jewish country. Look at the roots of Israel, look at where Israel came from, and you have others from other parties saying Israel, should be a secular country, a completely secular country. It should not have anything to do with religion. If Jews want to live here, if Jews want to be here, if Jews want to go to their holy sites, by all means, you can do that, but it should have nothing to do with the government. That the government should not have anything to do with religion. And Israel is going to have to decide. And I think I've said this to you before, but I'll repeat it again and again and again. Israel has to decide if it is a democracy or is it a theocracy, because it is very, very difficult in this new world that we live in to be both. It is very hard to be both a democracy and a theocracy.
What's the difference between a theocracy and a caliphate?
Well, a caliphate is governed by a caliph. A theocracy would be governed by the laws of the rabbinate.
Well, it's religion versus Muslim.
Yeah, it's Christian, it's Jewish religion versus Muslim religion. Yep. And it's the whole idea, for example, I'll give you, I read an article not too long ago, maybe 2-3 weeks ago, about kashrut, keeping kashrut in Israel, being kosher in Israel. And the standard in Israel is to be kosher. Because if you're not kosher, you lose a lot of business. Like Orthodox won't support you, the Haredi won't support you. So the question is, who is in charge of maintaining kashrut? Up until now, through Benjamin Netanyahu, it's been the Orthodox rabbinate. It's been the Haredim. Bennett has just recently announced that he's setting up a secular kashrut board, and it will be a municipal idea to set kashrut standards in Israel. And the rabbinate, it was like someone shook up a soda bottle and opened the top, and the Israeli rabbinate went flying in terms of condemnation of this government. How dare you take it away from the rabbinate? How dare you take it away? And he basically explained, if this is going to be both a secular and a religious country, it's going to work on standards that are applicable for all people, not just Orthodox standards, which I thought was amazing. I thought that was fabulous. I thought amazing that he was taking it out of the hands of the Orthodox rabbinate. I thought that was. I never thought he'd have the gumption to do that, but
there is in New York a municipal office to enforce kosher
standards,
kashrut in restaurants that are. Which I find to be just such an amazing contradiction and crossover between church and state. It astounds me.
That's right. But Israel crosses over church and state all the time.
I know, but
isn't
here,
it?
Yes.
Why wouldn't you have some rules? What's kosher and what's not? Why wouldn't you want to have rules of what's kosher and what's not?
Well, there are rules as to what's kosher and what's not. The question becomes, excuse me, I didn't hear the end of that.
That's why you have those groups in New York to make those decisions.
Right. Well, there always had been a kosher standard, but it was an Orthodox rabbinic kosher standard. For example, let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. If you serve kosher food Okay, if you serve completely kosher food, if all of the dietary laws are observed in a restaurant, and the restaurant serves food, say on Shabbat, does that make it non-kosher? Now, by the Orthodox religious rabbinic standards, you can't call yourself kosher if you're open on Shabbat. Okay? If you're open on Shabbat, if you're open on Jewish holidays, you cannot consider yourself, no matter how strict a standard of kosher food you have. So the question becomes, is kosher a standard of food, or is kosher a standard of living? And that's what needs to be determined by this board, by this secular municipal kosher board. What it is that determines kosher. Does it have to be according to what the Talmud says, or can it be simply the dietary restrictions placed on food, whereby, you know, Shemitah is observed and the slaughtering of animals are observed in the proper way, and the meat is soaked and salted, and
most of it is tradition.
What?
Most of it is tradition. It means clean.
Well, it means actually, the word
showroom in New York, I couldn't even have an event.
Actually, the word
Rabbi didn't permit it.
Actually, the word kasher means worthy. It doesn't mean clean. It's sort of a misnomer that it means clean. It means worthy, that which is worthy of being eaten. That's what the translation of kasher is. It's that which is worthy. Excuse me?
I was going to say that to me, the concept of having a secular kashrut is oxymoronic. Because it stems from the religion.
Not to me. I mean,
well, it may be. Well, think about it.
You can have a government.
Do Reform Jews practice kashrut? Pretty much no. And Reform Jews are more secular than Orthodox Jews. Mm-hmm. So to have the government set up where a bunch of secular people are passing laws about religion and religious, you know, they're basically they're taking jurisdiction over the religious precepts, perhaps to address modern times. That may be legitimate, but it's just dichotomous in my mind to have secular and Orthodox as an example.
Well, I think,
and also, if Israel's going to be a theocracy, then that to me is antithetical to democracy.
I think what Bennett and Lapid and this government are trying to do is to reduce the dominance of the Haredi rabbinate in Israel. I think they're trying to reduce that because I think they're reducing that because the vast majority of people in Israel are not Orthodox. Right. The vast majority of people in Israel they may be, you know, they may go to services on Friday night, but they're not Orthodox Jews. They may practice Orthodox minhag or Orthodox ritual, but they don't live their lives as Orthodox Jews. In other words, when they leave the synagogue, when they go home, they don't necessarily observe Shabbat. They don't observe mitzvot. They're not shomer mitzvot. They're not shomer Shabbat. They're not shomer holidays. They're not, you know, they live their life. They live pretty secular lives. And I think what this government is trying to do is that they're trying to reduce the dominance and the dominant thought of the strict Orthodox rabbinate. Like for example, they're in discussions now about marriage in Israel. Now, you probably know that in Israel, the only one who can marry a person in Israel is an Orthodox rabbi. That's the only way you can get a marriage certificate in Israel, is if an Orthodox rabbi officiates at the ceremony. For years, under the Netanyahu government, they've been trying to change that. And they finally set up a committee through this new government to discuss the idea of allowing non-Orthodox marriages taking place in Israel, whether that takes the form of secular marriages, whether it takes the form of simply allowing conservative and reform rabbis perform marriages, whether it takes the form of, I mean, there are many people. The last statistic I read was somewhere around 40% of the Israeli population leaves the country to get married. They go to Cyprus, they go to Greece, because they don't want to be married by the Orthodox rabbinate. They don't want the restrictions at their marriage. So
marriage recognized?
Excuse me?
Are there marriages recognized in Israel?
Oh yeah. You can marry outside of Israel and have your marriage recognized in Israel, sure. Yeah, but you can't be married in Israel by anyone other than an Orthodox rabbi. 7 months ago, the Supreme Court finally came down and said that the Israeli government had to allow non-Orthodox conversions to take place. I mean, this is something that the Reform rabbinate, the Reform movement, has been trying to get in place for 40 years or so. They've been trying to push for non-halachic, non-Orthodox conversions. In other words, conversions done by rabbis other than Orthodox rabbis. And the Supreme Court about 6-7 months ago came down with that dictum that the Israeli government has to accept non-Orthodox rabbi conversions. So now the rule is any rabbi in Israel can officiate at a conversion ceremony in Israel.
But there are other congregations in Israel other than the ultra Orthodox.
Oh yeah, there's Reform congregations, there's conservative congregations, there's Reconstructionist congregations, there are humanistic congregations. Yeah, sure. There's all kinds of congregations in Israel. The problem with Israel as it stands is that all Orthodox congregations are supported by the government. Anyone that's not an Orthodox congregation is not. There is no funding of non-Orthodox congregations in Israel. Reform congregations can't get funded.
That brings up to me a related question of who performs a bris? What kind, do you have to have an Orthodox rabbi present at a bris?
No, you don't need an Orthodox rabbi. The only one you need is a ritually trained mohel to perform a bris, and a mohel does not have to be a rabbi. Mohel has to be traditional. They have to have been schooled and educated in ritual circumcision. They have to do an apprenticeship, but they do not have to be a rabbi, and they don't necessarily have to be a member of a Haredi organization.
Okay. Yeah.
But they do have to be Shomer Shabbat. They do have to observe Shabbat and Shomer Mitzvot. They do have to observe mitzvot, but that's part of the regulation of being a mohel. Reform mohalim in the United States can only be certified if they are Shomer Shabbat and Shomer Mitzvot, and even though they're Reform Jews, they still observe Shabbat and observe holidays and observe mitzvot in a traditional manner.
Do they not do circumcisions in hospitals?
In Israel?
After delivery? Yeah,
They do.
the way
They
they
do.
do here.
They do circumcisions in hospitals. Yeah, you don't have to have a ritual circumcision in Israel. You cannot.
Just don't,
What you can't be is you can't be considered part of Kehilat Yisrael. You can't be considered part of the community of Israel if you're a male and have not had a ritual circumcision.
Really?
Except if there are physical reasons why a ritual circumcision or any circumcision cannot take place, like hemophilia, for example. Okay, if someone is born with hemophilia, they don't do a circumcision. They don't perform a circumcision. You know, if it affect in the spirit of what we call kuach nefesh, in the spirit of matters of life and death, you err on the side of caution, and you don't perform those kinds of things that might cause harm to the child. So traditionally, you can't, without a circumcision, you can't be part of the community of Israel.
Rabbi, could we go?
Doesn't mean you can't be an Israeli. It just means you're not religiously part of the community of Israel.
Could we go back to the issue of settlements for a minute? It's so discouraging to me that all these people are pro-settlement. Do you think it's possible to have peace in the Middle East as long as the settlements in the West Bank continue?
Do I think it's possible?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, I think anything's possible. I don't think it's probable that as long as you continue to build settlements, that there will be peace in the Middle East. I've always been in favor of a two-state solution, and I think the West Bank, you know, not including Israel and Gaza, is a good start for that. And in order to do that, I think the settlements on the West Bank would have to be given up. Now, that may sound like heresy, and I don't know that that will ever take place. But if you're going to hold with a two-state solution, if that's a possibility, I think that's the only way a two-state solution will ensue. I don't think I don't think you're going to be able to, the way they've built on the West Bank, I don't think you can sort of cookie cutter or gerrymander around these settlements and give them the rest of the land. I think building new settlements on the West Bank is provocative. I think it's provocative. I think it's not. I think it's not in Israel's best interest to continue to build settlements on the West Bank. I just don't think it's in their long-term viable best interest. I think it may be in their interest in the short term, you know, to build these settlements, but I think it's going to be harder to abandon all of these places if that has to be, if there is some sort of a solution with a two-state situation. You know, I mean, all you have to do is look at the demographics of the area, and you'll notice that the Palestinian population is growing in leaps and bounds in comparison to the Israeli population. As much as the Haredim and the Orthodox, you know, push the birth rate in Israel, it's not enough to keep pace with the Palestinian birth rate. So the number of Palestinians at some point in the future are going to overwhelm the number of Israelis. I mean, that's just pure numbers. And I don't think it's in Israel's best interest not to give them a place. I think that it's important to kind of take the temperature of where the world is at on this issue as well. Again, we're not back in 1948. You know, this is 2021, and times change, people change, attitudes change, politics change. I mean, all kinds of things change. And I think looking backwards at what was is not the dynamic you want for the future of Israel. That's just my opinion. It's just
You think it also maybe just choosing what you're eventually going to have to give up?
Choosing what?
Making a decision of what you're going to have to give up?
Yeah, I think you're going to have to. I think if there's going to be a two-state solution, you have to give up something.
Right.
And I think the more you build, the less inclined Israel's going to be to give up as much as they might need to give up for
If there is a two-state solution, will the Arabs be forced out of Israel, be forced to live in their state?
No, there are Arabs that are Israeli citizens. No, not at all. No, they hold Israeli passports. No, they're citizens of Israel. You can't force them out. It's Palestinians that are not citizens of Israel. The 20% that I'm talking about are Israeli citizens. They're Arabs that live in Israel that hold Israeli passports. They work for Israel. Some of them are Druzim. They served in the Israeli army. No, they're absolutely. They have businesses. They have businesses in Israel. They contribute to the economy. They pay taxes. They support the laws of Israel. No, they won't be forced out. Not at all. Not at all. And that's important. I think that's important for Israel because Israel has always been, a multicultural community. It's always been a multicultural dynamic, and I think it needs to remain that.
I agree.
So that's just, again, that's just from where I sit, from my reading, and my looking into what's going on. I mean, I read the Israeli newspapers actually in Hebrew daily, so I get it firsthand from what's going on in Israel, and it's just interesting to read where people are at now, and say, when I lived in Israel in the 1970s, when I lived there for 5 years. I mean, it's like a complete culture shift between then and now, in terms of listening to Israelis. I mean, it's very similar to what you're experiencing in the United States with culture wars and dynamic culture shift here in the United States as well. It's just different. It's different, and you have to be aware of the times in which you're living, and make decisions for those times and for the future. And that I'll say again, you can't keep looking backwards as to what was and to what might have been, or what could have been, or what should have been. I mean, you have to look what can be, what can happen, what can take place, what will be in the best interest of Israel, of Israeli citizens, of Judaism in Israel, of a Jewish homeland. I mean, all of these come into play when you talk about the future of Medinat Yisrael, of the state of Israel. All of that has to be considered. It's not simply one dynamic. It's many dynamics flowing into one big question.
Thank you, Rabbi. I think this is a very interesting hour, and actually hour and a half. And
I figured this one would cause a lot of generate a lot of thought.
And we'll do it again on December 7th.
Next month. Okay.
Good night, all.
Thank you, Rabbi.